For years, I looked at death as nothing more than a technical checklist. I would watch the monitors, track the vitals, and wait for the breathing to slow, thinking I understood the entire script of how life ends. It felt mechanical, almost predictable, until one particular afternoon changed everything I thought I knew about the final hour. A patient of mine had been completely unresponsive for days, lost in that heavy, deep silence we often see right at the very edge of life. Her family was gathered around the bed, speaking in hushed tones and simply waiting for the clock to stop. Then, without any warning, she opened her eyes with a clarity that shouldn't have been possible. She didn't look at her children or even at me. Instead, her gaze locked onto a specific, empty corner of the room. She didn't look confused or scared. She looked profoundly relieved. She smiled a genuine, beautiful smile of recognition and whispered, "I'm ready now. They've come." In that split second, the entire atmosphere in the room shifted from a medical event to something that felt like a destination. Usually, when a patient talks to people who aren't there, we dismiss it as a hallucination or a side effect of heavy medication. But there was a sharpness in her expression that defied every clinical explanation I had practiced for a decade. It didn't feel like her brain was failing. It felt like her senses were finally shifting their focus towards something we just couldn't see yet. The family froze, their whispers cutting off mid-sentence as they looked from her to the empty space she was addressing. You could feel the tension in the room thicken, a mix of desperate hope and cold, sharp confusion because, according to every monitor and chart I had, she shouldn't have been able to even blink, let alone recognize someone who wasn't there. Her daughter looked at me, her eyes pleading for a medical explanation, a name for the drug reaction. But for the first time, clinical terms felt like a total lie. In the medical world, we're taught that this is just terminal restlessness or a chemical misfire in the brain. But this didn't look like a glitch in the system. There was a weird, heavy stillness that settled over us, making the heart monitor sound out of place, like a ticking clock in a room where time had stopped mattering. It makes you wonder if the agitation we see is actually a struggle against the physical world, or if these visions are just a reality we haven't been invited to see yet. This was only the beginning of a pattern I couldn't stop noticing once I knew where to look. What looked like a breakdown of the mind was starting to feel like a very specific, synchronized preparation that happens to almost everyone. There's a hidden sequence to this arrival that most people miss because they're focused on the physical decline. But what if the things we fear the most are actually the signals that the hard part is already over? I began to realize that what I had witnessed wasn't an isolated incident, but part of a recurring pattern we often call the hospice stare. It usually starts when a patient who has been deeply unresponsive for days suddenly fixes their gaze on a specific, empty corner of the room. Their eyes don't wander or glaze over like you'd expect during a biological shutdown. Instead, they lock onto a point with a level of focus that feels almost magnetic. It's as if the physical world is starting to blur out, and they are beginning to see a different landscape entirely. To a family member, this moment looks like the ultimate sign of a failing mind, a final, confusing hallucination. They often try to pull the patient back, calling their name or standing in their line of sight. But the patient will often look right through them, as if they've become the ghost. But if you watch closely, you'll notice their breathing often steadies in these moments, and the tension in their forehead simply vanishes. It's the ultimate contrast. While the body appears to be at its weakest, the spirit seems to be having its most vivid experience yet. But here is the detail that truly changes how you look at the end. Many patients will begin to reach out their hands, palms up, as if they are being helped or greeted by someone just out of reach. It isn't the frantic, grasping motion of someone in pain or fear. It's a slow, deliberate movement of recognition. And once that connection is made, the heavy, labored struggle for breath often gives way to a profound, quiet peace that leaves the rest of us in the room feeling like we are standing on the threshold of something we aren't yet meant to understand. When a family sees their loved one staring into a corner or reaching for the air, their first instinct is almost always fear. They assume the patient is confused, hallucinating, or worse, in physical pain that isn't being managed. I've seen daughters lean in, frantically trying to block that empty space, begging their mother to stay with them. They think the brain is short-circuiting, and it looks like a tragedy unfolding in real time. But that's the first big misunderstanding we have to address. In a clinical setting, we often label these movements as terminal restlessness or agitated delirium. and the standard response is to increase the sedation. We see a body that is no longer acting normal, so we assume something is going terribly wrong. It looks like a struggle, a desperate fight against an invisible enemy. However, if you step back from the monitors and really look at the patient's face, the expression doesn't match the supposed pain the family is so worried about. This is where the reality of the situation completely breaks away from our perception. What looks like a crisis is actually a transition. We see the body failing, but the patient is often experiencing a profound sense of arrival. It's like watching someone through a window. We see them moving and reaching, but we can't hear the music they're dancing to. Once you realize that the agitation is actually a focus on a different reality, the fear in the room starts to evaporate. But what exactly is it that they are seeing? When you sit by the bed, the first thing you notice is the change in how they breathe. It often sounds heavy or irregular, and it can be terrifying to listen to if you don't know what it means. Most families think their loved one is struggling for air, but it's actually the opposite. The body is simply letting go of the need for oxygen. It's a rhythmic, automatic process where the lungs are slowly clocking out, yet the patient remains in a deep, peaceful state. But why does this happen in such a specific, predictable way? Then there's the change in color, a phenomenon where the feet and hands begin to turn a mottled, bluish purple. To the untrained eye, it looks like a cold, painful circulation failure, as if the body is breaking down under intense pressure. In reality, the system is just becoming incredibly efficient. It's pulling all its remaining energy away from the extremities to protect the heart for one last, vital mission. It looks like a loss of life, but it's actually the body's way of focusing everything it has left on the transition ahead. As the physical body narrows its focus, the level of consciousness begins to shift into a space that medical charts struggle to define. We see someone who is unresponsive, yet they often react to things we cannot perceive, like a whispered name or a familiar face in an empty corner. It isn't a random glitch or a side effect of the medicine. It's a synchronized sequence where the brain stops processing the room around them to make room for a different kind of awareness. But what if this isn't the mind failing at all? When you see these three things happen together, the rhythmic breath, the cooling skin, and that distant, focused gaze, you realize it's not a chaotic accident. It's a blueprint. Every human body seems to know exactly how to shut down the physical world to prepare for what comes next. We perceive it as a tragic breakdown because we only see the exterior, the failing machinery. But the closer you look, the more it feels like a very deliberate, quiet preparation for a journey that has already begun. I remember a man named Henry who had been in a deep coma for nearly a week. His vitals were a steady downward crawl, and the room was filled with that heavy clinical expectation of the end. His son sat by the bed, checking his watch every few minutes, treating the silence like a burden. We all thought Henry was already gone, his mind long since extinguished by the physical failure of his organs. But the monitors were actually lying to us. Suddenly, Henry's breathing shifted from a labored rattle to a sharp, clear intake of air. He didn't just wake up, he arrived. His eyes snapped open, and he reached out his hand toward the foot of the bed, his fingers trembling with a strange kind of excitement. His son jumped up, thinking it was a seizure or a final struggle for life. But Henry wasn't struggling. He looked past his son, focused on a space that was, to our eyes, completely empty. He began to nod, as if he were listening to a conversation we couldn't hear. The most haunting part was the look of pure, childlike recognition on his face. He whispered a name, one his son later told me belonged to a brother who had died 30 years earlier. The son started crying, but not out of grief. He saw the peace on his father's face and realized the hallucination was doing something medicine never could. It was taking away the fear of the dark. That was the moment the medical checklist failed me. Henry didn't die in a state of confusion. He died in a state of connection. He fell back into a deep sleep just seconds later, and his heart stopped shortly after that. It looked like a sudden crash to anyone watching the screens, but for those of us in the room, it felt like a door had finally opened. And this is exactly where the science of the brain meets something we can't yet measure. For so long, we've looked at the rattling breath and the distant stare as the debris of a collapsing life. We've treated these signs like a medical tragedy we need to manage or a fire we need to put out. But when you sit in that silence, you realize you aren't watching a machine break. You're watching a traveler pack their bags. The hospice stare isn't a loss of focus, it's the sharpening of it. Every physical symptom we fear is just the body's way of stepping aside so the person can finally see what's waiting. It changes how you stand in a room when you realize your loved one isn't lost in a fog, but is actually the most awake person there. That realization turns a moment of terror into one of profound, quiet awe. We spend our lives running from this final hour, but the end isn't a wall. It's a bridge the body already knows how to cross. Once you stop looking at the monitors and look at the peace in their eyes, the heavy weight of the unknown starts to lift. I don't see death as a checklist anymore. I see it as a homecoming we just don't have the words for yet. If this shift has changed how you feel, I invite you to share your reflections below and stay with us as we explore these mysteries together on the channel. Because in the end, it's not about how life fades, but about how beautifully we are prepared for what comes next.